What chemicals, heavy metals, or pesticides are the greatest danger to humans?
Yeah, I think one of the questions that we really face is, you know, should we be looking at one particular pesticide, one particular heavy metal? And while on one hand, I really appreciate, for example, what's happening now with glyphosate, we realize the most pervasive pesticide utilized in human history, it seems by any measure. It's out there, it's dangerous, it's everywhere we go. At the same time, by concentrating on any one, we eliminate it and the industry slides another one in right behind it to replace it. That's the pesticide treadmill. And what I'm really concerned about is, all right, we can't win that battle. That's not one where we can just replace one with the other. We have to go back to the organic farming, organic gardening. That's what we need to really understand and focus on.
Are the chemical regulatory agencies around the world more responsive than they are here in the United States?
I think when you look around the world, it's really fascinating. For example, the EU, I think my friends there, and certainly writing this book, A Precautionary Tale about one story in the EU, I think the EU very often, they feel demographic pressures and therefore they feel the impacts of the choices that farmers are making and the industry is making more than we do in the US in some cases. So I think the EU has been more progressive, certainly have been really interested to watch Vandana Shiva and her colleagues in India and being able to really kind of hold down the fort in trying to maintain biodiversity and organic principles. And that's not always a challenge. So I think there are other places in the world, Bhutan, which is trying to go 100% organic. It's fascinating to see these places, and as they're really trying to hold on, not just to their health, but to their traditions, to really what was, again, given them by virtue of being part of the culture that they inherited.
What are your concerns with genetically modified foods?
So certainly concerned about the unknowns in terms of genetically modified foods, that we really don't understand so much of the impact. When we do start to understand it, it's very complex. It starts to get down to the cellular level. And there are people and places that I trust, information resources to go and look. For example, Jonathan Latham with Bioscience Resource Project, is a great resource. Someone who is really looking with his partner Allison Wilson, looking at these studies, trying to understand what it means. With the GMOs, I also worry about them being used as systemic pesticides, so that actually with the genetically modified organisms, the pesticide basically is found in every cell in the plants, in some cases. That starts to be scary because then we're ingesting pesticides on a whole different level than we were before. And finally, there's the sovereignty piece once again. We don't control the seed or any aspect of that industry. We simply accept it and take it in, not knowing what the ultimate outcome might be.
What are the health risks to children from chemicals and pesticides? Are there studies that prove this?
So certainly, children are much more susceptible, just by virtue of weight and growth and everything that's happening. And I say children, but then it's also what's happening, in the womb. And that's where some of the scariest impacts, seem to be happening with some of these chemicals, because these chemicals, be they the active ingredients in pesticides or these inactive ingredients, which very often those inactive ingredients are there to actually, in some cases, break down cellular walls so that the pesticide itself can penetrate and get in. So, when that's happening and then these things are actually going into the human biome, then it starts to get to be really scary, because when you've got the development of the fetus, that's the point at which there's a real danger of having a significant impact.
Is it more dangerous to have a cocktail of different chemicals and pesticides in our body as opposed to just one chemical at a time in our body?
It probably is more dangerous. I suppose it depends on which particular active ingredients we're talking about. But so when we go out and we do the research on one active ingredient, we try to isolate all the variables, that are out there in the environment. That's hard research to do in terms of its impact on humans and other organisms. Then when we start to think about how these different active ingredients or pesticides interact, we have what are called the combinative effects. And the combinative effects come about. There can be an additive impact, as those pesticides mix with one another. There can be a synergistic effect as they interact with one another and do things that were unexpected, by virtue of the single chemicals. And then there also can be an antagonistic reaction between those, that exacerbates, the actual impact there. So frankly, we don't even know what's happening out there with these combinative effects in many ways, nor does anyone have the time or the science dollars to figure out all those possible combinations and what those might mean, and in different proportions.
Why should we be concerned about chemicals in our food, water, soil, and environment if the amounts are very small?
Yeah, so it's interesting with what we consider to be small. First of all, there's a regulatory challenge in knowing, when is a little bit too much. That's a real challenge, and these are variables that they're done very often by research, but sometimes it's guesswork, and sometimes a regulatory agency decides, for whatever reason, to raise the threshold of safety. That might have been an influence decision in many cases. But we also are finding out with these combinative effects that sometimes even the smallest amounts, as they come together with two different active ingredients, two different pesticides, that there's a lot more happening there than ever would have happened with the single active ingredient itself.
Can you sum up everything we've talked about here today in 15 seconds?
So I think in terms of the conversation that we've had today, if it were to be summed up, it's what we do to the soil, we do to ourselves. What we do to the things that we eat, we do to ourselves. And what we do to ourselves, we do to our communities. And in many cases, there's an injustice there. And by being more beneficent, more benevolent in terms of everything that we do in our food production, we've also embittered our communities and given us all a brighter future.
What's the one thing I must do today?
Eat as much organic food as possible, and you can decide whether you want that to be certified organic or that your farmer, trust your farmer, and that's enough. And by investing in that farmer, in those farming practices, you've invested in your future. You've also invested in the betterment of the landscape and likely the community. So that's about as important as it gets, in my view.
Why did you find it important to come here and speak at the Real Truth About Health conference?
What I really appreciate about the Real Truth About Health conference is the fact that they're bringing together people from so many different perspectives, from the medical community, scientific community, folks like myself who are educators, activists, authors, to really sort of provide this kaleidoscopic view of health, because I think that's important. I mean, we can, whenever we want, we can put on our blinders and we can go one way with the world in terms of understanding our diets, but I think it's really, really important for us to be able to think together collectively, to have this knowledge that is more holistic by virtue of the discussions that happen. None of this is easy. It's not easy science. It's not easy policy or education, but it's so important to have these collective conversations, because that's where we get to the truth.
If people wanted to learn more about your work, where should they go?
So I've been fortunate enough to be able to work with Chelsea Green Publishing now for, I guess 15 years. And so Chelsea Green has the 3 books that I've done, A Precautionary Tale, and then also Rebuilding the Food Shed and Up Tunkett Road. They're wonderful publishers to work with, and really in the first publishers in the United States to focus on sustainability and claim that as a niche, but not just in terms of what they have done, but it's really their lens of seeing things and moving forward. Yeah, so I think when we get into the world of pesticides and we try to understand, okay, how do we tackle this? Because it's a complex world. It's not pretty. It's fraught, in terms of the players and the history there. And so what I really get excited about, and the bright spot for me, is being able to talk about organic agriculture, regenerative agriculture, by whatever name we decide we're going to use. That's the beauty of it. And so I've been really fortunate to be able to be at Sterling College. We're now in the Dean of Professional Studies, and we have this great program, which is School of the New American Farmstead, where instead of always talking about pesticides and the dark side, we get to sort of illuminate the bright side and bring people together to figure out a new path forwards, which that part's really exciting. That's where I get jazzed. I mean, let some of us old dogs go do the fights with the pesticide industry. Let's let the younger folks go forward fresh and really just out there to learn and to do and to make and reshape and build off of this wobbly foundation that we gave them.